Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her when she passed him in the hallway, voice pitched just loud enough for the residents to hear. Just a nurse with trembling hands and a limp that got worse on double shifts. Just a nurse who kept her head down and her mouth shut and knew her place in the hierarchy of Sacred Heart Hospital's cardiac wing, where doctors were gods and nurses were the invisible machinery that kept the gods' reputations polished. He had no idea who he was looking at. Katie Morrison arrived for her night shift at 6:27 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, moving through the cardiac wing like water finding the path of least resistance. 12 years of military service had taught her how to be present without being noticed, how to occupy space without claiming it. Her scrubs were the same shade of blue as everyone else's. Her name badge hung at the same angle. Her shoes made the same soft whisper against the polished tile as she moved from the locker room toward the nursing station, where the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song and the smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a benediction or a warning, depending on the day. Today felt like a warning. The cardiac wing at Sacred Heart was a cathedral of competence and careful hierarchies. Monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath. The ventilation system whispered cool recycled air through vents designed to eliminate contamination before it could settle. 37 beds. 12 nurses. 4 doctors. And 1 attending physician who had built his reputation not on saving lives but on ensuring that everyone in the hospital understood which lives mattered most. Dr. Marcus Hargrove had inherited his position the way some men inherited money, through family connections, through the kind of old money networking that happened on golf courses and in country clubs where decisions were made over scotch and handshakes that cost 6 figures to honor. Katie checked the assignment board. Night shift. Cardiac ICU beds 12 through 19. 8 patients. She'd handled worse. She'd handled catastrophic hemorrhage in the field with nothing but field dressings and prayer, handled compound fractures in a Chinook with rotor wash shaking the entire fuselage, handled the kind of medical crisis that made civilian hospital emergencies look like stubbed toes. But that was the old Katie. That was Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, and she'd left that woman in Kandahar for years ago because keeping her alive had meant slowly losing her mind. The limp was real. The trembling hands were real. The way she made herself small in rooms full of doctors, that was the most important performance of her life. She moved through the ward, her practiced eye assessing each patient with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent years in forward operating bases. Bed 12, post-operative coronary bypass, stable. Bed 13, acute myocardial infarction, oxygen saturation holding at 94%, good. Bed 14, congestive heart failure exacerbation, diuretics running, output appropriate. Bed 15 held Captain James Reynolds, 26 years old, recovering from shrapnel wounds sustained in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, where the mountains turned soldiers into ghosts and some ghosts tried to become doctors. She stopped at his bedside just long enough for her breath to catch. Marcus. Her son Marcus served under Captain Reynolds. She'd never told him where she'd gone after his father's funeral. Never told him that his mother had spent for deployments watching young men like his commanding officer bleed out on desert landing zones, that she'd held their hands while their eyes asked questions she couldn't answer. Never told him that she'd woken up one morning in a forward operating base outside Jalabad and realized that if she didn't disappear, she was going to end it all, quietly and finally, in a supply tent at 0300 hours. So she disappeared. Honorable discharge on medical grounds. No details provided. No explanation given. Just a shadow mother who'd raised him the first 16 years and then become a rumor he didn't quite believe anymore. Katie checked Captain Reynolds for line, a 20-gauge angiocath in his left forearm, solution running clear, no signs of infiltration, and her hands moved with the kind of precision that only comes from battlefield medicine. 100 crisis scenarios had written themselves into her muscle memory. 1,000 emergency procedures had become as natural to her as breathing. She'd inserted 4 lines in the dark. She'd established central access under fire. She'd done a needle decompression for tension pneumothorax while a Marine screamed and his lung re-inflated and his eyes went from panic to grateful in the space of 3 seconds. That competence was dangerous. That competence was a threat. Dr. Hargrove entered the cardiac wing at 7:15 p.m., his white coat pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his movements the kind that announced he owned the space before he'd even spoken. He was tall in the way that tall men become after spending their whole lives being told that height was destiny, that size was authority. His jawline could cut glass, and his eyes held the particular coldness of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. 43 years old. Inherited his position from his father. Married to the hospital board chairman's daughter. For golf handicap. Zero accountability. He watched Katie working, watched her secure the 4-line with movements that belonged in a trauma bay, not a civilian hospital ward. His eyes narrowed. He saw the competence but dismissed it. Just a nurse with technical skills. Just someone trained enough to follow protocols, not intelligent enough to understand them. Just a shadow in scrubs who knew how to follow orders and would quit within a week if he made the working environment unpleasant enough. He'd broken 3 nurses in the last 2 years. The previous one had lasted 18 days before she transferred to pediatrics, crying in the bathroom on her final shift. Katie felt his gaze like weight. She didn't look at him. She finished checking Captain Reynolds' vitals, heart rate 78, regular rhythm, blood pressure 118/72, stable, and moved to the next patient with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from knowing exactly how much of herself she could show before questions started getting asked. She documented everything. She followed every protocol. She made herself indispensable without ever making herself visible. At 7:24 p.m., the night shift settled into its rhythm. The hospital's exterior world had quieted. The day staff had gone home to families and dinners and the kind of civilian lives that Katie had tried to construct around the edges of her survival, the way someone builds a boat from scrap wood and hopes the current doesn't notice. Her son Marcus was at home in their small house in Portsmouth, probably doing homework, probably not thinking about his mother who worked nights and maintained the kind of distance that felt like safety. She had kept her son in the dark. She had kept everyone in the dark. She had built a vault inside her chest and locked the old Katie inside it and thrown away the key. But then Dr. Hargrove found her at the nurse's station at 8:12 p.m., surrounded by 3 residents who watched him the way young animals watch the alpha predator. He smiled. It wasn't a smile. It was a showing of teeth. Katie, right? His voice was the kind that didn't require a name to know it owned the room. I've been watching you work. Very competent. Very technical. Very adequate for a night shift nurse. He paused. His audience waited. The silence had weight. Tell you what. I'm going to make a little wager with the staff. How much do you want to bet that you'll be gone within a week? You look like the type who can't handle the pressure of working with actual physicians. The emotional labor gets to people like you, I think. Katie turned to face him. Her hands were steady. They'd learned steadiness in places where shaking hands got people killed. That's very kind of you, Dr. Hargrove. 8 words. Deferential. Safe. The mask that had kept her alive. I'm sure you're very confident in your assessment. He smiled wider. He thought he'd won. The residents laughed on cue, the way young animals laugh when the alpha establishes dominance. Katie turned back to her charts. She documented Captain Reynolds' vitals one more time. She checked the medication reconciliation. She made herself small again, invisible again, just a nurse who knew her place and accepted the hierarchy and would be gone before the week was through, just like Dr. Hargrove predicted. He had no idea who he was standing next to. What happened next didn't happen for 2 more days, but it changed everything. The third-year resident stood beside Captain Reynolds' bed with a tablet, reviewing the morning labs while Dr. Hargrove wrote orders in the chart with the kind of flourish that suggested he was signing art rather than prescriptions. Katie moved through the monitors like she was reading a language only her hands understood, checking leads, noting rhythm, documenting O2 saturation. 100% routine. 100% dangerous. Hargrove's voice carried the particular confidence of a man who'd never been wrong in public. Reynolds needs a loading dose of amiodarone. We'll start at 300 milligrams for push, repeat in 5 if needed. He didn't look up from the chart. The resident typed it into the computer, fingers moving toward the medication dispensary. Katie's hands stopped moving. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then she spoke without looking at either of them, her voice the texture of calm water over granite. That's 60 milligrams per kilogram, doctor. Captain Reynolds weighs 180. Should be 240 for the loading dose. She pointed at the monitor. His ejection fraction is already compromised. 300 puts him into bradycardia risk. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm in the corner bed. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His pen stopped moving. The resident's fingers froze above the keyboard. For a moment, nobody breathed, and Katie knew what she'd just done. She'd exposed his math in front of a learner. She'd suggested, with surgical precision and clinical evidence, that he'd miscalculated. In a hierarchy built on the assumption that doctors never made mistakes in front of nurses, she'd taken a scalpel to the entire structure. "I'll adjust the order," the resident said quietly, already pulling up the corrected dose. Hargrove didn't acknowledge Katie. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything at all. He just closed the chart and walked out of the room with his shoulders squared and his face the color of a brick. Katie returned to Captain Reynolds' monitor. She didn't let her hand shake until Hargrove was gone. An hour later, she found him in the nurse's station, holding court with the casual dominance of a man who'd decided his humiliation would become someone else's problem. She was carrying her lunch tray, chicken soup, apple, roll, the kind of quiet meal she always made because it didn't require conversation. She wasn't trying to walk past his table. But the hallway was small, and his voice was large, and he made sure 6 people heard every word. "I'll bet anyone here $20 that our little wallflower Katie quits within a week," he announced, not looking at her, letting the words hit her like a thrown stone. "Some people just aren't cut out for real medicine. They take one shift where they have to think for themselves and they fold like wet tissue." He smiled. Looked around the table. "Who's with me?" The nurses exchanged glances. The kind of glances that meant they saw what he'd done. The kind of glances that meant they couldn't do anything about it. Someone's phone suddenly became fascinating. Someone else pretended to read a chart. The silence of compliance stretched across the table like a closed fist. Katie kept walking. She made it 3 steps past before Hargrove extended his foot and caught the edge of her tray. The soup spilled first, hot chicken broth spreading across the tile like a stain, the bowl clattering against the floor with the sound of something breaking. The apple rolled under a table. The roll scattered. For a second, everything moved in slow motion, and then Katie stood holding an empty tray while the lunch she'd carefully prepared that morning pooled in front of her on the hospital floor. She didn't move. She didn't cry out. She stood there holding the tray, and her eye caught Hargrove's for exactly long enough for him to see that he hadn't actually broken anything. He'd just made a mess. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with him, her jaw working once, and then she set the tray down and bent to gather the scattered food. Her hands were steady. Not calm, but steady. The kind of steady that comes from having already survived worse. The kind of steady that comes from having picked up pieces in the dark. "I've cleaned up worse, doctor," she said, her voice like an echo from another room. She didn't say it to insult him. She said it like she was stating fact, the way you'd say the sky was blue. Like she was simply helping him understand what he was actually looking at. She picked up every piece. She wiped the floor. She threw everything away. That afternoon, Hargrove found her in the hallway with Captain Reynolds' chart in her hands. He was moving toward rounds. He was moving toward a moment he'd planned, the way a shark plans blood in the water. His colleagues were still talking about what he'd done in the cafeteria. His dominance had been established. Now he just needed to make sure she understood it. He stopped in front of her, his presence making the air pressure change, and he reached out and plucked the chart from her hands. Not took it. Plucked it. Then he threw it at her feet with the kind of care that suggested he'd been practicing the motion. It fell open, pages scattering. Pick that up, sweetheart. Or is bending over too much to ask? The hallway wasn't empty. 2 residents walking toward oncology. An attending from trauma passing in the opposite direction. 3 nurses at the med station who suddenly found their computer screens very important. They all pretended not to notice. They all saw. Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath a person takes when they're making a choice to stay instead of run. She maintained eye contact with Hargrove as another tear escaped down her cheek, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of being crushed in public and not being allowed to show pain. She bent slowly, gathering the pages of the chart, rest-tacking them with hands that didn't shake because they'd learned not to. And when she held the chart and met his eyes again, something in her voice had changed. It dropped an octave. It carried weight. "My son serves under Captain Reynolds in that bed," she said with devastating calm. "I'll pick up anything to stay near him." The words landed like a detonation. Hargrove's face went red, the kind of red that comes from sudden, catastrophic understanding. He'd been bullying someone connected to the patient. He'd been throwing charts at a mother trying to stay close to her son's commanding officer. He'd turned a professional embarrassment into something that looked, very suddenly, like cruelty directed at a woman with legitimate reason to be fighting to keep her job. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like he was looking for words that didn't exist. But Katie was already walking away, moving down the corridor with the kind of posture that suggested she'd never needed his acknowledgement anyway. Behind her, Hargrove stood holding the invisible weight of what he'd just realized, that he hadn't actually broken her, and that whatever he'd tried to establish had just been dismantled by 4 sentences and 1 tear. The real problem was that Hargrove wasn't a man who responded to humiliation with grace. He responded to it the way predators respond to bleeding prey. That night, the graveyard shift settled over Sacred Heart like a blanket. The hospital's nervous system slowed to a different rhythm, fewer visitors, quieter hallways, the kind of darkness that made every monitor beep sound like a warning. Katie worked the cardiac wing alone after midnight, moving between beds with the efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that exhaustion was just another vital sign you could manage if you trained yourself not to acknowledge it. At 2:48 a.m., Captain Reynolds' monitor spiked. The sound cut through the silence, not the regular beeping of a stable heart, but the urgent ascending tones of a code alert. Katie was already moving before her brain had finished processing the rhythm. The captain's oxygen saturation was dropping fast. 88, 82, 76, his jugular veins were distending like they were being inflated from inside his body. His trachea was deviating toward his right shoulder. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung creating positive pressure that was collapsing the other side. She was at his bedside before the 3rd alarm. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 100 scenarios that had nothing to do with Norfolk and everything to do with Sanjin. She called the code while already prepping the needle decompression kit, her movements precise and economical, the way a surgeon moves in a locked ORH. The angiocath needle came out of the sterile pack in her hand like she'd materialized it. 14 gauge. "Come on, Captain," she said, locating the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, her fingers finding the exact anatomical landmark her body had learned through repetition and survival. "Stay with me." She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess. She drove the needle between his ribs, and for a second nothing happened, and then there was a hiss, the sound of air under pressure escaping into the room. The sound of a lung re-inflating. The captain gasped. Color rushed back into his face. His oxygen saturation climbed. 76, 84. 92, 96. The rhythm stabilized. The tension drained out of his chest and out of the room, leaving behind only the mechanical certainty of monitors returning to baseline. Katie's hand started shaking. Not before. After. She was still documenting medication times, vital signs, the exact procedure, her notes precise and clinical, when the crash team arrived 8 minutes later. They found her standing at the bedside with the captain stabilizing, his oxygen climbing steadily, his rhythm steady. The on-call physician stared at the decompression needle still in place and then at Katie with the expression of someone trying to understand what had just happened. "Spontaneous pneumothorax," she said, her voice back to being just a nurse, just a voice. "I performed needle decompression at 2:51. Immediate response." They didn't ask her how she knew what to do. They just handled the clinical aspects, getting a chest tube set up, getting Reynolds scheduled for imaging, calling surgery to assess. Katie moved to the supply room and restocked her kit with hands that had finally stopped shaking, each item going into its place with the same precision she'd used 20 minutes before. She was still straightening instruments when Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He was in scrubs. He'd been called in. He was holding the documentation she'd submitted, reading it with an expression that started as shock and moved, minute by minute, into something darker. Something that looked like calculation. "That was quite a performance, Morrison," he said quietly. His voice had changed. Not angry. That would have been easier. This was something worse. This was the voice of a man who'd just decided you were a problem that needed professional solving. Where exactly did a temp agency nurse learn combat medicine? Katie's hand stopped. Her face went pale. Not from fear, but from the particular ice-water realization that she'd just exposed herself. That her hands had known what to do before her mind had time to convince them not to. That in saving Captain Reynolds' life, she'd revealed something she'd buried 8 years ago in the Norfolk rain. "I took an advanced trauma course," she said, the lie thin and transparent as tissue paper. Hargrove smiled. And smiled the way a man smiles when he's just found something sharp to use. "I don't think so," he said. "I'm going to find out exactly who you are." He turned and walked out, and Katie stood alone in the supply room surrounded by bandages and syringes and the particular silence that comes right before everything changes. Her fingers found her locker, the small dent in the corner, the thin space where she kept something no one at Sacred Heart Hospital was supposed to know about. She pulled out a pair of worn combat boots, leather soft from a decade of field work, and held them against her chest while her hands finally did what they'd been wanting to do all night. They started to shake. And they didn't stop. Hargrove's hands were still shaking when he left the supply room. Not from fear. From rage. He'd watched her perform that needle decompression with the muscle memory of someone who'd done it 100 times before, maybe 1,000 times. Under fire. In places she had no business being, doing things that went far beyond the scope of a hospital nurse. He needed answers. He needed documentation. He needed to destroy her credibility before anyone else figured out what she actually was. By 6 in the morning, Hargrove was on his personal line to Gerald Wickham, board member and his weekly golf partner. Wickham was mid-breakfast on his screen porch in the historic district when the call came through. Hargrove didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have a serious problem in the cardiac wing. A nurse, Katie Morrison, performing procedures she's not trained for. Dangerous overreach. I have witnesses." Wickham set down his coffee. "How dangerous?" "Needle decompression. Without physician authorization. Without documentation. That scope of practice violation at minimum. At worst, it's assault with a medical instrument." The lie was smooth. Practiced. The kind of lie that only worked when wrapped around a grain of truth. Katie had performed the decompression. Hargrove was just reframing who gave the authority. The silence on the line told Hargrove that Wickham understood the leverage immediately. "I'll call the director. We need an external review team before this becomes a liability." "Today," Hargrove said. "Before shift change." By 9 o'clock, the external review team had been contacted. 3 investigators from a medical compliance firm in Richmond, the kind of firm that specialized in what hospitals called risk mitigation and what everyone else called character assassination through paperwork. They would examine Katie's employment records, her clinical notes, her behavior reports. They would build a case that looked airtight because Hargrove had already built it for them. he just needed documentation to match the narrative. At 10, Hargrove made his second call. To Beacon Personnel Services, the temp agency Katie had used 8 months ago when she first arrived at Sacred Heart. She'd specifically chosen temporary work because it meant minimal background investigation, minimal follow-up, minimal paper trail. She'd been trying to disappear. Hargrove was about to make sure she couldn't stay disappeared. I need references for Katie Morrison. Former temp employee. Cardiac nursing. The voice on the line was uncertain. That information is confidential, Dr. Hargrove. Then let me be direct. She performed an unauthorized medical procedure. I need her work history documented for a review process. If your agency can't help me, I can contact the state licensing board and explain how one of your placements endangered patient safety. The threat was buried in corporate politeness. The HR director understood it anyway. I'll email you what we have. But honestly, her file is sparse. Limited references. 7-year employment gap before she came to us. That was concerning at the time, but she was highly qualified for the position. 7 years. Hargrove felt something click into place like a lock opening. 7 years of nothing. No job, no address, no verifiable existence. Katie Morrison hadn't just walked away from something. She'd walked away from someone. Someone important enough to make her disappear completely. The email arrived in 12 minutes. 2 references from a medical staffing company in San Diego. One from a Dr. Patricia Okafor, who'd apparently supervised her 8 months before she came to Norfolk. The file noted that Katie had listed her reason for departure as family circumstances and need for relocation. That's all they had. That's all she'd given them. Hargrove called Patricia Okafor directly. The woman answered on the 3rd ring, and her voice changed the moment Hargrove identified himself as Dr. Hargrove from Sacred Heart, calling regarding a former employee. Katie Morrison is an extraordinary nurse, Okafor said carefully. If there's a concern, I'm sure there's an explanation. There's an allegation of protocol violation. I need to understand her background. The gap in her file. What was she doing for 7 years? The silence on the line lasted for seconds. Long enough for Hargrove to hear Okafor choosing her words like someone defusing a bomb. That's not something I'm at liberty to discuss, Dr. Hargrove. What I can tell you is that Katie Morrison saved lives. Many of them. She served with distinction. Whatever you're investigating, you should be very careful about your conclusions. She hung up. Hargrove set the phone down, mind-running calculations. Served with distinction. That wasn't medical language. That was military language. And suddenly the needle decompression made sense. The calm under pressure. The way she'd moved with terrifying fluid precision, hand steady as a surgical laser, like someone who'd done emergency battlefield medicine when the choice was save someone or watch them die. Katie Morrison wasn't just a nurse. She was something else. Something that had required 7 years to recover from. And now Hargrove was going to make sure everyone knew that she'd been hiding. By noon, the external review team had set up in a conference room on the 2nd floor. They requested Katie's complete file, all her clinical notes from the past 8 months, and a formal statement about the unauthorized procedure from the night before. They scheduled interviews with her supervisors, the residents who'd been present, and the patient whose life she'd saved. Hargrove sat across from the lead investigator, a woman named Patricia Chen, and outlined his concerns with the precision of someone who'd been planning this. Her employment history is incomplete. She appeared 8 months ago with minimal background verification. Yesterday, she performed a needle decompression without authorization. Scope of practice violation. Dangerous. Reckless. I have concerns about her training, her judgment, and whether she's actually qualified for this position. Chen made notes. Professional. Non-committal. But Hargrove could see her calculating. A nurse with 7 years of missing employment history had just performed advanced emergency medicine. That was either criminal negligence or something else entirely. The investigation would determine which. Or at least, it would determine which one Hargrove's narrative was strong enough to make stick. Katie learned about the investigation through hospital gossip. A resident she'd worked with mentioned it casually while they were reviewing charts in the NICU hallway. They brought in some compliance team. Asking questions about you. She kept moving, kept writing vitals, kept her voice level. What kind of questions? About yesterday. Your training. How long you've been here. It's weird. Dr. Hargrove seems to think you overstepped something. Katie nodded once and continued to the next patient room. But her hands had gone cold. Not with fear. With clarity. She'd seen investigations before, she'd conducted some herself when someone made a mistake in a firefight that cost lives. She knew how they worked. How they built walls around you, brick by brick, each statement and document a weight that pressed harder as the days went on. Hargrove wasn't trying to prove she'd done something wrong. He was trying to prove she'd always been someone to be suspicious of. The gap in her resume was the first crack. The military precision in how she'd moved during the decompression was the second. Now the investigation would widen those cracks into chasms. She'd walked away from the Navy specifically to avoid this. The fame, the attention, the questions about where she came from and what she'd done. She'd chosen anonymous night shifts and minimal medical license in a civilian hospital where nobody asked questions because nobody knew she had secrets to ask about. She'd chosen to be forgettable. Unremarkable. Just another nurse in scrubs with steady hands and a quiet competence that nobody needed to examine too closely. That choice had just expired. The HR meeting came 3 days later. Katie sat across from a woman named Linda Chen, who had a file approximately 2 inches thick sitting on the desk between them. The fluorescent light above them hummed with a sound like insects trapped in plastic, and Katie could smell the coffee Linda had brought in, burnt, acidic, the kind that sat in a pot for 6 hours and tasted like failure. Your employment history, Linda began, opening the file. There's a 7-year gap. Between 2017 and 2024. Can you explain that? Katie kept her voice level. Calm. The way you spoke when you were being interrogated about something you couldn't discuss. Personal reasons. The external review team needs more detail. For their report. I was dealing with a medical condition. I'm recovered now. Linda pushed her glasses up her nose. She was sympathetic, that was worse than if she'd been hostile. Sympathy meant she was about to make a decision she actually felt bad about. The review team is also asking about your qualifications for the needle decompression you performed. Did you receive specific training for that procedure? Yes. Where? And there it was. The question that had no answer that would help her. Katie could say the Navy, and the investigation would expand exponentially into her classified service record. She could lie, and when they found out, and they would find out, it would confirm every suspicion Hargrove was planting. She could refuse to answer, which would look like she had something to hide. Combat medicine training, Katie said quietly. Years ago. But the clinical skills don't expire. Linda wrote that down. It wasn't an answer that closed any doors. It was an answer that opened every door simultaneously. I need to be honest with you, Linda said, and Katie could hear the sympathy in her voice calcifying into something harder. The external review is recommending further investigation into your background before we can continue your employment. They're concerned about gaps in your documentation. Until this is resolved, we're putting you on administrative leave. Full pay, of course. But you can't work patient care. Administrative leave. That was the coffin. That was Hargrove making sure Katie couldn't access patient records, couldn't be present during shifts, couldn't prove her value anymore. She was being cordoned off, isolated, made radioactive while they built their case against her invisible past. When will the review be complete? 2 to 4 weeks. We'll contact you when they've made their determination. 2 to 4 weeks of waiting. 2 to 4 weeks of Hargrove consolidating his power, of investigators reviewing her files, of the hospital culture shifting around her. She could feel it happening already. The way staff she'd worked with suddenly didn't quite meet her eyes. She was becoming the nurse with something to hide. She was becoming a liability. That evening, Marcus called. He was at his grandmother's house in Virginia Beach, and his voice had that careful quality that teenage boys used when they knew something was wrong but were trying to act normal about it. "Hey, Mom. My school called. They said the hospital emergency contact wasn't valid anymore. Did you change numbers?" Katie closed her eyes. She was sitting in her apartment in Norfolk, the one bedroom where her only personal possession was a pair of worn combat boots in the bottom of the closet, boots with sand still in the laces from San Jin, from a combat deployment she'd never told her son about because she'd never told him anything that mattered. "Just a system error at the hospital," she said. "I'll fix it tomorrow." "You sure? You sound weird." "I'm fine, baby. Just tired from work." It wasn't a lie. It was a lie with the shape of a truth. She was tired. She was so tired that she could feel it in her bones, in the places where shrapnel had left scars she never showed anyone. She was tired of running. Tired of hiding. Tired of being forgettable. She hung up the phone and walked to her bedroom closet. She pulled out the combat boots. They were caked with dust now, preserved like artifacts from a life that had belonged to someone else. She held them in her hands, and for the first time in 7 years, she let herself remember what it felt like to be Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. Not the person who'd come home broken. Not the person who'd needed to disappear. The person before all of that. Someone who'd held a line when everything was collapsing. Someone who'd made impossible calls and lived with the consequences. Someone who didn't break when people tried to break her. The letter came by certified mail the next morning, and Katie signed for it with a hand she kept absolutely steady. The rain fell in sheets, the kind that hammered pavement like applause nobody wanted. Katie stood at the bus stop 2 blocks from Sacred Heart, a cardboard box balanced in her arms. The box held everything that mattered: a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent with leaves like brown paper, and a photograph of her husband in dress blues, his smile untouched by what was coming. The termination letter was dissolving in her hands. She could watch the words bleed down her coat, effective immediately, breach of protocol, insubordination, the ink running like watercolor, like evidence of a life being erased. She didn't cry until the words were gone. Then she did. Standing under the hospital's light that spilled across the parking lot, she cried with the kind of silence that made it worse. No sound. Just shoulders that moved and a face that stayed steady. 3 hours earlier, the HR director had handed her an envelope across a desk that smelled like industrial cleaner and lies. "You understand the board's position," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. Hargrove had been thorough. The external review team, his network of favors, the pressure on the temp agency, it had all collapsed like dominoes that had been standing too close together. Katie Morrison had no clearance in their system anymore. She was a liability. A mistake. Just a nurse who thought she could survive by not being seen. But that wasn't the worst part. Inside her locker, she'd left her husband's combat boots. The pair he'd worn through 2 deployments before a roadside IED in Kandahar made sure he never needed boots again. She'd kept them there for 7 years, hidden under her spare scrubs, the only tether to who she used to be. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had carried those boots into Sacred Heart Hospital 7 years ago, wrapped in plastic, a reminder that some people don't get to put things down. Now she was leaving without them. They were evidence of something, and evidence was dangerous. She'd made the choice not to retrieve them, not to risk opening her locker while Hargrove's eyes were still watching. The boots stayed behind. Everything stayed behind. The bus didn't come for another 12 minutes. Inside Sacred Heart, in the cardiac wing on the 3rd floor, Captain Reynolds was sleeping the sleep of a man who'd been told his lungs would hold. The needle decompression had saved his life. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a machine Katie had calibrated by listening to his breath, and he didn't know, couldn't know, that his commanding officer's savior was about to be erased from the building's records like she'd never existed. At 7:43 a.m., a man named Derek Fawcett pushed through the emergency entrance of Sacred Heart. His name was in the system, flagged as a repeat visitor, a frequent caller, a liability. He'd come to the hospital 3 times in the last 2 months asking for OxyContin refills. Dr. Hargrove had turned him away every time with the kind of dismissal that made it clear the doctor considered Derek's pain a personal failing. Derek had been using fentanyl to fill the gap that Hargrove had created. The fentanyl had turned his thoughts into something that moved sideways, like crabs at the bottom of an ocean that only he could see. He was carrying a 9mm Ruger he'd bought from a man in a parking lot in Virginia Beach. The security guard at the front desk didn't see the gun at first. Derek had it under his jacket, and his hands were shaking so badly that the guard mistook it for palsy, the tremor of a sick man. But Derek's eyes gave it away, the pupils blown so wide they looked like tunnels. He was asking for Dr. Hargrove. His voice was loud. A nurse at the registration desk stood up. Derek pulled the Ruger free. The motion looked slow and fast at the same time, like something happening in a dream where you can't move. The security guard reached for his radio. Derek fired. The shot went through the ceiling tile and the sheet truck beyond it. The sound was like a car crash in an enclosed space, impossible and absolute. The overhead intercom crackled, "Code Blue, main entrance." "Lockdown." "Code Blue, main entrance." "Lockdown." Derek was already moving. He knew the hospital's layout from 3 visits, and his brain, operating on the chemistry of rage and fentanyl, had decided that if he couldn't find Hargrove in the first-floor waiting room, Hargrove would be in the place where Hargrove saved the important patients. The cardiac wing. The elevator was closing. Derek slammed his shoulder into it. The doors opened like a mouth. He rose toward the 3rd floor with his hand still shaking around the gun, already composing the things he would say to Hargrove before he fired. Katie was at the bus stop when her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, "Coach says we can make the state tournament if I pull my grade up in calculus. Can I stay after school for tutoring today?" She was typing a response, of course. "Love you," when she heard the first gunshot echoing across the parking lot. The sound traveled differently in daylight. It sounded smaller. She knew that sound anyway. She knew it the way her hands knew things her brain was trying to forget. She dropped the cardboard box. The boots in her locker. The photograph now in a puddle. The mug, cracking further. She was already moving back toward the hospital entrance before her conscious mind caught up. 7 years of not being a senior chief petty officer, 7 years of scrubs and deference and hands kept still, and it all vanished in the time it took her to register what she was hearing. The second shot came from deeper inside the building. Katie pushed through the ground floor entrance. The lobby was chaos in the way that hospitals understand chaos, controlled evacuation, staff moving with purpose, the intercom repeating its code that meant everyone knew danger was present and everyone knew what to do. Except Katie. Katie was moving against the crowd, toward the stairs, because she knew exactly what she had to do and protocol wasn't it. She reached the 3rd floor. The cardiac wing was sealed behind double doors with a keypad, but the lock had been overridden by the security system during lockdown, left accessible for emergency evacuation. Katie pushed through. The hallway was empty. Most patients had been moved. Most doors were closed. The gunman was kicking open the door to Captain Reynolds' room. Katie saw it happen the way soldiers see things in combat, the moment stretching like rubber, every detail burning in at full resolution. Derek's face. The gun rising. The small shock on Captain Reynolds' face as consciousness returned to find a threat there instead of safety. The captain's hand moving toward the call button. Katie walked into the doorway. She did it quietly, the way she'd learned to move through kill zones when the difference between living and dying was whether you belonged to the space you occupied. "You don't want to do this," she said. Derek's eyes found her. His pupils were so dilated she could see the hospital lights reflected in them. "Where is Hargrove?" His voice had the stretched-out quality of someone speaking from inside a chemical bubble. "Not here," Katie said. Her voice had changed. The nurse's careful deferential tone was gone. This voice came from somewhere deeper. This voice belonged to a person who had pulled wounded Marines from burning buildings and held their hands when their bodies could no longer hold them. "You need to lower the weapon." "I need a doctor," Derek said. And he fired. The bullet was meant for the bed. Katie stepped directly into its path. The physics of the moment were simple: her shoulder, the bullet, the trajectory that would have gone through her into Captain Reynolds. She felt the impact like being hit with a sledgehammer made of fire. The round tumbled through the deltoid and shattered the humerus, a shattering that felt like her arm was being unmade. She didn't go down. This surprised Derek enough that he hesitated for exactly 2.3 seconds. That was all the time she needed. The closed distance takedown was muscle memory compressed into 8 seconds. Step 1, move inside the gun's arc. Step 2, control the weapon arm with both hands despite the white-hot explosion in her shoulder. Step 3, drive him backward into the wall. Step 4, disarm. The gun fell. Step 5, transition. Katie's forearm locked around Derek's neck in a rear-naked choke, the kind of chokehold that didn't require intact shoulders, that required only the pressure of blood vessels and the certainty that you would not let go until the threat stopped breathing. Derek's eyes started to roll back at 7 seconds. At 8 seconds, his body went slack. Katie maintained the hold until security arrived 30 seconds later. She was still holding him when the medical team rushed in with trauma equipment, still holding him when they asked her to release him, her grip staying locked while her body began to understand that the fire in her shoulder was spreading. Her left arm was on fire. Her left hand was losing color. She was looking at her own blood on the floor and thinking about how blood left patterns that told stories if you knew how to read them. When she finally released Derek, her arm wouldn't move. It just hung there, useless and wrong. Captain Reynolds was shouting something. She heard her name. She heard "She saved my life." She heard footsteps. Hands reaching. A paramedic saying "severe hemorrhage, brachial artery compromise, we need to move now." The room tilted. Then there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the knowledge that she'd just destroyed whatever privacy she had left. She'd just shown them exactly who she was. The boardroom at Sacred Heart Hospital smelled like burnt coffee and fear. 12 board members sat around a mahogany table that cost more than most people's houses, watching the double doors like predators sensing movement downwind. Patricia Chen, the board chair, had called an emergency meeting for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Nobody knew why. Not yet. The rain outside hammered the windows like applause from a crowd that had seen something extraordinary and couldn't quite believe it was real. Dr. Roger Hargrove sat at the far end of the table, his tailored suit pressed with surgical precision, his silver cufflinks catching the fluorescent light. He'd spent the morning calling in favors, ensuring his narrative stuck. The nurse had violated protocols. The nurse had lied about her background. The nurse had endangered a patient with an unauthorized procedure. Simple. Clean. Contained. His phone buzzed with a text from Gerald Wickham, one of the board's most influential members. Wickham had already committed to supporting the official narrative. By the time this meeting ended, Katie Morrison would be a cautionary tale about hiring people with gaps in their employment history. Hargrove smiled. He'd already won. The doors burst open. A teenage boy in a wrinkled school uniform, the collar of his shirt still holding the crease from this morning's fold, carried a mahogany shadow box against his chest like it contained something sacred. 16-year-old Marcus Morrison walked straight to the center of the table, his eyes moving from board member to board member until they landed on Patricia Chen. His voice, when it came, was steady as a laser sight. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison." The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became a physical thing, something you could feel pressing against your ribs. Gerald Wickham's pen froze mid-stroke across his legal pad. The external review team's lead investigator leaned back in her chair, suddenly uncertain. Patricia Chen's expression shifted from administrative concern to something else entirely, recognition mixed with the slow dawning of understanding that she'd been lied to. Marcus opened the shadow box. Gold medals caught the light. Ribbons in colors that didn't belong in a hospital boardroom. Devices and stars and bronze anchors that spoke a language only certain people understood. Hargrove's face drained of color so quickly it looked like someone had pulled a plug. Patricia reached across the table and took the shadow box from Marcus's hands. Her fingers trembled as she studied each decoration. These are. She looked up at the boy. Where is your mother? She's at home. Resting. She got shot yesterday protecting Captain Reynolds. The bullet went through her shoulder. She's in pain, but she wanted me to bring these because... Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Because I found them. Because she's been hiding them. Because everyone needs to know who she really is. The administrator, a man named Thomas Way who'd spent 30 years in hospital leadership without ever seeing anything like this, stood up from his chair. Get me her military file. Right now. Every deployment record, every commendation, everything. Within 90 seconds, a junior staffer had pulled the Pentagon's database. The file was 15 pages long. Thomas Way's hands actually trembled as he read it aloud, his voice picking up speed as the weight of what he was reading became impossible to ignore. Silver Star for the extraction of 6 wounded Marines under direct fire in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. He paused. Someone gasped. Bronze Star with Valor for medical intervention under combat conditions. Navy Commendation Medal. 2 Purple Hearts. He looked up from the document. Navy Cross. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside. The Navy Cross. The second highest military decoration. Katie Morrison hadn't just served. She'd been a legend, and they'd fired her for correcting a dosage calculation. A Marine Corps colonel stood up from the back of the room. He'd arrived with the Pentagon's call, officially, his uniform somehow making the mahogany table look smaller. His voice came out like gravel in a tumbler. Senior Chief Morrison extracted her unit from a Phi-base attack in 2011. 6 wounded. 2 KIA already. She moved through enemy fire for 400 yards carrying a 185-pound Marine on her back. Another Marine in her left arm. She set them down behind a low wall and went back. She went back because there were still 2 more out there. He let that sentence hang. She came back with 1. The other was already gone. But she went back anyway because that's what senior chief petty officers do. That's what warriors do. Hargrove opened his mouth to object. His face had cycled through red to white to something approaching purple. This is absurd. She violated protocols. She hid her background. She performed a procedure without proper authorization. A man stood up from the left side of the table. Carlos Ruiz. IT Director. Navy veteran. His laptop was already connected to the boardroom screen. Dr. Hargrove requested that all security footage from the past 2 weeks be deleted yesterday morning. Carlos's voice was the calm of someone who'd already made his decision and found peace with it. He cited storage space concerns. The screen came alive. The cafeteria. Katie's tray flying through the air. Coffee and sandwich parts scattering across white tile like a crime scene investigation. Hargrove's face, caught mid-sneer. Every staff member in the vicinity deliberately looking away, training their eyes on their own meals as if turning invisible could absolve them of complicity. Play the next segment, Carlos said. The nurse's station. The chart hitting the floor. Hargrove's voice, captured in crystalline audio, picked that up, sweetheart. The way Katie retrieved it without trembling. The way her voice came out like a weapon sheathed in velvet. My son serves under Captain Reynolds in that bed. I'll pick up anything to stay near him. Hargrove's face, flushing red. Understanding, finally, that he'd miscalculated. And this, Carla said, is Dr. Hargrove making a public wager in the nurse's station that Senior Chief Morrison would quit within 1 week. The footage rolled. Hargrove's exact words, now evidence. His arrogance captured in 4K resolution. The board members watching like they'd just discovered their breakfast was poisoned. I've preserved every frame of the past 14 days, Carlos continued. Every interaction. Every incident. And I've forwarded complete copies to the State Medical Board, the hospital's malpractice insurance carrier, and the Joint Commission. I've also documented Dr. Hargrove's request for deletion, which may constitute destruction of evidence. Gerald Wickham physically slid his chair away from Hargrove. The message was unmistakable. I was told this was about patient safety, Roger. You said she was dangerous. The external review team's lead investigator submitted her actual findings on the screen. Katie's needle decompression technique was textbook perfect. The equipment was correctly chosen. The location was precise, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Captain Reynolds's oxygen saturation had climbed from 68% to 94% in 90 seconds. Not only had she followed every protocol, she'd executed it with the kind of muscle memory that only came from doing it in the field, where the consequences for error were immediate and lethal. The temp agency sent their correspondence log. Hargrove's pressure tactics laid bare. His implied threats. His requests for clarification on employment gaps that he already knew he'd caused by blacklisting her from every position that required a background check. Patricia Chen called for Hargrove's immediate suspension pending investigation. Her voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the kind of power that didn't come from a committee or a network. It came from someone finally seeing clearly. The Marine Corps colonel stepped forward. His uniform pressed. He's bearing like something forged in a furnace. The Pentagon is considering whether Dr. Hargrove's actions constitute federal interference with a veteran's employment rights. We take care of our own. And Senior Chief Morrison is one of ours. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. His carefully constructed network, the board members who owed him favors, the connections built over 20 years of golf games and country club dinners, evaporated in the time it took for Carlos to click a mouse. This is absurd, Hargrove finally managed. She violated protocols. She hid her background. Marcus stepped forward. His shoulders squared. His voice coming out with the steadiness of someone speaking truth into a vacuum. She hid because of PTSD. Because people like you make it impossible to heal. My mom saved Captain Reynolds's life. She took a bullet yesterday because she cares more about protecting people than protecting herself. And you fired her because she corrected your math. The room turned on Hargrove completely. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was worse than that. It was the simple, inevitable rotation of professional consensus toward the truth. Security was called. His medical privileges were suspended pending investigation. They gave him a cardboard box, the same kind Katie had carried to a rain-soaked bus stop, and escorted him out of the building. By evening, every major hospital in Norfolk would know. By morning, the State Medical Board would open an investigation. By next week, his name would be flagged in 3 different employment databases as a disciplinary risk. The network he'd built so carefully would start distancing itself, each connection suddenly remembering urgent meetings elsewhere, apologizing profusely for any misunderstanding. 6 months later, Katie Morrison walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance in a crisp white coat. The embroidery across her chest read Director of Emergency Medicine. Her limp was less pronounced than it had been. Therapy and physical rehab and the simple fact of being allowed to exist as herself again had accelerated her healing in ways no medication could achieve. She'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in military trauma. She'd finally named the nightmares. She'd stopped sleeping in her car sometimes, stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopped expecting the world to betray her again. Marcus walked beside her, carrying his school backpack, shadowing her for a project about career paths. He beamed with a pride so pure it was almost painful to witness. This was his mother. Not the quiet nurse who stayed invisible. The senior chief. The legend. The woman who'd been living in the space between her 2 identities, finally allowed to integrate them into one person. Her new office was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the parking lot where the rain fell in clean, honest sheets. On her desk, beside the shadow box containing her medals and Marcus's school photographs, Katie had placed her husband's combat boots. They were worn leather, creased in all the right places, the soles scuffed from 1,000 patrols. She'd kept them in a locker throughout everything, the humiliation, the firing, the bullet wound. They'd been her anchor to who she was when the world insisted she be someone less. Captain Reynolds visited on his 3rd follow-up appointment, fully recovered, moving without the careful restriction of someone still healing. He found Katie reviewing staffing schedules and delivered a letter of commendation from his unit. His eyes were clear and alive, the eyes of a man who understood exactly who'd saved him and why. The hospital's new harassment prevention training used anonymized footage from Carlos's archive as a case study in institutional bullying. Every new hire watched the footage of Katie's tray being knocked to the floor. Every new hire learned that competence doesn't always protect you. But every new hire also learned that sometimes truth finds a way out. Katie ran into a former colleague in the hallway one afternoon. The colleague mentioned, casually, that she'd seen Dr. Hargrove at a strip mall on the edge of Norfolk. He had a folding table outside a dollar store, selling supplemental insurance policies. His medical license was under review. His board connections had evaporated. He was trying to rebuild from nothing. Katie felt no satisfaction. Only exhaustion. The price of her victory was measured in months of pain, of isolation, of nearly losing her son to a lie. She wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even Hargrove. But she also wouldn't apologize for surviving it. That evening, she addressed a room of new nursing graduates at their orientation. The auditorium was full, 60 young people, most of them women, all of them carrying the weight of choosing a profession that would ask everything from them and thank them with minimum wage and 12-hour shifts. Katie stood at the podium with her shoulder still sometimes aching in the cold. "I thought staying invisible would keep me safe," she said, her voice carrying to the back rows with the clarity of command. "I thought if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, unthreatening enough, the world would leave me alone to heal. But safety isn't the same as healing. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people see you. Let them see your scars. Let them see what you're capable of. Let them see your boots." She looked at Marcus in the audience. At the combat boots visible through her office doorway on the shelf behind the stage. At the scar on her shoulder, visible now, no longer hidden, where the bullet had passed through. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she concluded. "When no one's watching except yourself. That's when you find out who you really are. Not the version you perform for people who scare you. Not the version you've been trained to accept. But the real version. The one who survived. The one who'll survive whatever comes next. That's the version worth being." The room erupted in applause. The sound echoed off the auditorium walls like rotor wash from a helicopter coming in to land. If you loved Katie's story, you know what to do. Subscribe for more tales of hidden warriors and impossible comebacks. Like this video to support creators telling stories that matter, and comment, what would you have done in Katie's position? Who in your life deserves to be seen the way the Pentagon finally saw her?